This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Sorry about that. I literally had to fly in from outer space.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to the 150th episode of Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, that's all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, well, from episode 1 onwards, it's been about films, the stories of films. It's given away in the title, isn't it? I tend to look at production stories, development stories, behind the scenes stories, marketing stories, all the little bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast, well, they have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm invested or interested in to some degree. I try not to do snark, I try not to punch down, I just try and celebrate the fact that people got films made, and I really cherish that an awful lot. This is being recorded in December 2020, so it is the latest in my little run of festive themed episodes. A couple of corkers again for you this time round. I'm going to take you back first of all to 1984. Let's have a clip from this one. I'll tell you the story the other side of this.
What is it?
No.
It's your new pet.
Come on, Barney, be a good dog. You're kidding. Dad, it's really neat. Where did you get this?
Some little junk store in Chinatown.
Can I pick him up, Dad?
Sure, go ahead. Just be careful. You gotta be gentle.
I will.
I hope he's housebroken.
Oh, isn't he cute? Has it got a name, Dad?
Yeah, Mogwai.
What?
Mogwai. I don't know, it's some Chinese word. I just call him Gizmo. He seems to like it.
As you probably already guessed, we're back in 1984 for Gremlins, directed by Joe Dante, written by Chris Columbus, the cast led by Zach Galligan and Phoebe Cates, but also including Hoyt Axton, Kay Luke, Don Steele, Corey Feldman, Harry Carey Jr., Dick Miller. You get some Judge Reinhold for your money in there as well. Chuck Jones has a cameo too. In fact, quite a few really good cameos in this one. But the actual genesis of it all, well, you go back to Chris Columbus, now known for directing the first two Harry Potter films, first two Home Alone films, more recently the Christmas Chronicles 2. But at the point we're in the early 1980s, he was an upcoming screenwriter. He'd not yet done The Goonies, which would follow shortly afterwards, but he'd come up with what he thought was a horror picture. And so he talked about this recently in an interview with the Collider website, and he talked about how he was living in New York. He had mice running around the floor. He's watching old Universal horror films, and his friend suggested to him, "You love monster movies, why don't you write one?" And so that's how he basically came up with the idea for what would become Gremlins, these mice running around his apartment at night, and just really the chills they put through him. The first draft as well was very reflective of monster movies. That Columbus has admitted it would have been a hard R-rated film. A sequence in the original script where Billy Pelt's mum's head comes rolling down the stairs, where the lead characters of Billy and Kate go into a McDonald's where none of the food is eaten, but all of the people are eaten. And it was a dark, dark film. It was a film where the character of Gizmo would have turned into the character of Stripe halfway through. And he was still at New York University at the time, and there was a report, director Joe Dante's talked about this, where it suggested that he basically did it as a writing sample that hadn't ultimately been intended to be made, but just to get him noticed. And it was just a lot more horrific. Now, Joe Dante, meanwhile, he'd just done The Howling, a horror comedy, and horror comedies were suddenly in vogue in the early 1980s. Now, Spielberg had seen The Howling, and he cast Dee Wallace in E.T. off the back of it. But Steven Spielberg had also seen the script for Gremlins. It had come to his attention at his Amblin Entertainment Company, and he saw it as, well, this could be a nice low-budget film that we could do. It's not going to be the trickiest film to make, is it? Right. So it all started to knit together that the script made its way to Joe Dante, courtesy of Spielberg, who had also seen Dante's work on Piranha. And Dante talked about how the script arrived in the mail at his office. He just finished a film called Meltdown, which hadn't done... basically, he described it as Meltdown had melted down. But Dante opened the script at this small rundown office, really, and he thought it had come to the wrong address, because it turned out it was from Spielberg, and that Spielberg had seen Dante's work and was interested in Dante working on this particular project. So this would have been the first production for Amblin, for Spielberg's company Amblin as well, that Dante was asked to join Spielberg and John Landis on the Twilight Zone movie. And I mean, the Twilight Zone movie is infamous as well for umpteen reasons, and I might come to that in a future podcast. But at this point, it's really important to note that Gremlins was expected to have the tone and the price tag of The Howling, but as they looked at it more and more and more, it was clear that the budget was going to go up, and this would need studio backing. This couldn't be done, well, as a small independent film. But fortunately, pretty much every studio in town wanted to work with Steven Spielberg in the early 1980s. By this point, Jaws had come out in the 70s and had been a huge hit. E.T. had become the biggest film of all time at the American box office. Raiders of the Lost Ark, that was a sensation as well, and he got over his bump over the financial disappointment of the film 1941 and set up his Amblin company to make films just like this. And so Spielberg took the film to Warner Brothers and figured needed about $10-15 million to get this movie made. In the end, the budget was said to be $11 million. Now, Dante talks extensively about this on the commentary tracks that you'll find on the DVD and Blu-ray and 4K release of Gremlins. And Dante described what Warner Brothers gave the film as, quote, a blinking green light. And the problem was, it took a long time to work out how to do this film. That this was a film that relied, bluntly, on gremlins, on these small creatures running roughshod right around the movie. And it was going to be a really ambitious mix of live action performances and animatronic and maquettes and puppets and all sorts of practical effects to realise these. And also, tonally, it was going to be walking quite a tight line as well. So producer Michael Finnell and director Joe Dante, he'd agreed to do the film at this point, told Warner Brothers, really, we can't get this film going up and running overnight, that you can and ah over the movie as much as you like, but when you give the green light, there's still going to have to be quite a lot of preparation time to get this film ready. And so what they did is they persuaded Warner Brothers to give them some seed money just to start building stuff. That they kind of figured Warner Brothers would give them a small pot of cash, and then at the point they decided to go with the movie, they could get it, they could mount it a lot quicker. And so in came Chris Wallace to do the effects work, and Wallace was doing test shots, and basically he Finnell and Dante kept going to Warner Brothers to ask for more money. Wallace didn't know that this was the arrangement that was going on, but conversely they had to budget every single day of pre-production. And there's a story that comes up on one of the commentary tracks on the disc about how Warner Brothers executives queried the expense of $5 on a kitchen knife for the movie. A phone call that went on for 20 minutes that involved 2 or 3 people from the studio at various points coming on the call, and as someone pointed out, this phone call has cost more than the knife. The script continued to develop because there was a tonal shift that was taking place. That Spielberg, for instance, decided very late in the day that the character of Gizmo, who's seen the character designs of the central gremlin, was really cute, and he shouldn't turn into Stripe halfway through the movie, and he should be around for the whole film. Chris Wallace nearly collapsed at the thought of just what that entailed, because one suggestion from Spielberg, and it was the right suggestion, everyone concedes, meant that the second half of the film would suddenly need a lot of gizmo involved. And if you've seen Gremlins, the second half of the film is where some key action sequences and more kinetic sequences take place. But the puppet that they were building for Gizmo hadn't been engineered to do any of the stuff it needed to do on screen. I mean, at this stage, they were late in pre-production, and pre-production went on for 7 months. And all along, they were coming up with ways to do really complex shots, pretty much inventing it as they were going along. Every creature needed to be built. They had to look at which creatures needed to move, what they needed to achieve in camera. All the while, the rest of the mechanics of putting a film like this together were going on. So casting was going on, for instance, and the key hires really were Zach Galligan and Phoebe Cates, the two young leads of the movie, Billy and Kate. And originally the casting took place in Los Angeles. They did extensive casting calls. They looked at lots of potential actors to take on those two roles. As it turned out, they got no joy in Los Angeles, went to New York and found them in the first day or two of just hunting casting in New York. And I chatted to Zach Galligan about this a few years ago, and he said, and I asked him, this is like the big role of your career. How tricky was it to get? And he says the thing that's so weird about Gremlins was that people would think there was some massive competition for the role, and maybe there was behind the scenes. But as far as I experienced it, I went in and met the casting director, Susan Arnold. We had a chat for 10 minutes. Came back the next day, met the producer. He apologised, said Joe Dante was sick and couldn't make it, but he really liked my reading, so he wanted to see my reading. And then he asked me afterwards if I'd come in a couple of days later at screen test, and he said sure. So this is all less than a week, and when he went back, there was Phoebe Cates, and Galligan and Cates got paired together. They put them both on tape. They said thank you. Off they went. Galligan went off for a short break. He was gone for a day and a half when he got a call saying you've got to come right back because you've got the part. And Galligan would say, it was one of the easiest parts I've ever gotten. It just doesn't make any sense. Also, as part of the pre-production effort, Jerry Goldsmith was writing the score. This was, it's not commonplace now, but it was a little more then, that the score for the movie was being written before the film shot. And again, this goes to the point where they were struggling to capture the tone of it. Is this a horror? Is this a comedy? And Dante tells the story of just going around to composer Jerry Goldsmith's house and listening to him play the Gremlin rag, the main theme from the movie, just on his piano in front of him. And Dante admitted he just wasn't sure. Is that right? Would that work? And he just figured in the end, that's Jerry Goldsmith. He must know what he's talking about. And Julie went with it. Filming then would get underway in Burbank, Los Angeles on the 27th of April 1983. And to give you an idea of just what a massive job they were taking on, the film wouldn't come out for another 18 months. And this was at a point where films oftentimes were starting shooting 7-8 months before they were being released in US cinemas. Not so here, because from day one on Gremlins, the production team have admitted they were in over their head. They didn't have the time. They had the time to do what they needed to do. They didn't really have the budget. They certainly didn't have the experience, and they quickly became aware there's a reason no one had really tried to do anything like this before. And whilst the film had a relatively big crew, it was the kind of thing where everybody had to pitch in. So there's a sequence where the Gremlins are watching Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, infamous sequence in the film, delightful sequence, where there's about 100 Gremlins in that particular shot, and members of the crew are having to come in and just operate the puppets just because they needed that many people hands on deck at that point. Even when they did shoot that sequence, and it goes to the fact that this was very practically driven, they didn't have enough puppets to fill the cinema, so they had to shoot it in bits and put it together optically. There was lots of kind of old style effects that they were also using, changing the speed that they cranked the camera. Some shots were shot in reverse. Those little bits and bobs really that helped them realise Gremlins without the aid of CG. By the time they came to make the sequel, a lot of what they were trying to do, because primarily they'd done a lot of the pathfinding as well, was a lot simpler. Here it was constantly uphill. I mean, the actual physical, and they made this on movie sets primarily, which was deliberate for a couple of reasons. They went for the Warner Brothers and Universal backlots. Joe Dante wanted a stylized look for the film. He wanted this to look like a movie. He didn't want it to look too real. They were shooting oftentimes in the dead of summer in searing heat with fake snow and extras in winter clothing. But also when they were doing the soundstage based work, I mean, it's almost like a Muppet movie that they had to build the sets a few feet above the floor to allow room for the operators of the Gremlins, who were watching oftentimes on little monitors that were showing everything in reverse, and thus the actors were performing whilst there was a network of activity going on underneath. There was, I mean, there's little things as well. And there's one bit where there's an attack with a Christmas tree where basically the operator of the Gremlin had to be in the Christmas tree. You can just, there's the occasional glimpse in the movie where you can just see, like, someone, in the case of that Christmas tree bit, you can see his shirt just fleetingly. And there are a couple of moments where you can just see the joins, but you really have to look for them. It's an incredible achievement, really, that it all looks quite so seamless. Dante also liked the fact that they were shooting on the Universal backlot. I mean, the town square that played host to Back to the Future, It Came from Outer Space and Tarantula, and he liked the warmth of a studio lot and also the warmth that it gave the film. It's worth noting too that one person who really warmed to the puppets was the dog that you see in the movie, and they talk about that quite a lot on the commentary track as well. But basically, the way that they structured the filming of this is they did the first bunch of the first block of filming was done with the actors and the sequences where Gremlins interacted with the actors. But the problem was the technicalities were getting trickier and trickier and trickier. There was a first glimpse right near the start of Gizmo just peering out of a box, and you barely see him. And they talk about how it had taken 7 months just to get to that point. And at the point that they shot that bit in the movie, that is all the puppet that could do. That was it. That was the limit of what they were up to at that point. They also, I mean, it's worth noting as well that Spielberg, even though he wasn't directing the film, he was still relatively hands-on, that he needed to approve everything. He ultimately had final cut on the movie as well. So in the end, when they were designing Gizmo, they made him the same colour as Steven Spielberg's Cocker Spaniel at the time, in the hope of getting an approval, and that certainly worked, although given that work was already underway on the fur coats of the puppets, the more complex design clearly went down incredibly well. Once the human stuff had been shot, the production shut down for a week or two before there were several months of just Gremlins, and this gave Chris Wallace a little bit of extra time just to try and catch up. But he's talked in the past, and he talks on the disc as well, about he was only ever really a day or two at best ahead of what the production needed. One thing that also happened during that break in film is the merchandising department kind of realised what they had on their hands with the look of Gizmo as well. But the Gizmos that were being made and the Gremlins that were being made for the film, well, they came in various flavours because, let's just say, some were more expressive than the others. So whenever you see a close-up of Gizmo in the film, what you're actually looking at is a puppet that was 2 feet wide. They made much bigger versions of them because that was the only way really that they could effectively capture the facial expressions of the Gremlins on screen. The smaller Gremlins, meanwhile, that they made, they couldn't alter the facial expressions, and instead it sounds like, I mean, it's an old stop motion technique. Aardman still uses it to this day on its movies, where they basically had interchangeable faces that they moved between the puppets as and well when they needed. There's an early moment with Gizmo in Billy's bedroom where you just see a very slight black line on Gizmo's face. It's just because his face was just coming loose under the searing heat of the studio lights as well. But just going to that bedroom sequence as well, it just gives you an idea of just the level of preparation that was required to realise this film, because the sets had to have lots of holes drilled in them for the puppeteers. It's one of the reasons they couldn't go and they couldn't hire a house and just shoot on location, because they'd have had to drill so many holes in people's houses. It just made it really far, far simpler to do it on a studio stage. Even then, simple is not the word that would be used. When they used like double size Gizmo for the close-ups, all the props around had to be double size as well. So there's a bit where Gizmo's on some comic books. The comic books had to be double sized. when early in the movie we first see Gizmo get wet and balls of fluff, which we'll come to realise are the other gremlins, start bouncing off him. It was hair balloons being pushed through a hole in the bed. That oftentimes, whatever you're seeing in the film, there's a human being operating something just out of sight that you can't see. They had to shoot lots and lots of coverage of these early sequences as well, because they just didn't know what speed to crank the camera at. They had to try a few different alternatives to give them options when it actually came into the cutting room as well. Such was the level of pathfinding that they were doing. Even with, and particularly the sequences where you've just got a couple of gremlins on screen, it's worth noting, again, it goes back to the craft of things like the Muppets, that you've got 4 or 5 people operating each puppet just out of sight. Oftentimes there were remote controls on remote controls, that they were using quite rudimentary technology to realise these crucial characters in the film. Lots of the puppets also, even outside of just changing the facial expression, they just couldn't do anything else. They were trying, Dante and his team were shooting lots of things that just didn't work, and so had to cut things out. And because they didn't really have time for rehearsals, because the technical work on creating workable gremlins was so close to the wire, they were learning on the job. And it got to a point where there were certain complex shots that they were trying to do with the puppets, where if they fluffed the shot, it would take an hour or so just to reset, to go for another take. I mean, we're not quite the level of James Cameron's Titanic, but the level of complexity was let's just say, high. The executives from Warner Brothers, meanwhile, they were being broadly supportive during production, but there was also the protective cover of Steven Spielberg there, but everything was taking a long time to do. And people would come on set and they would just see a lot of downtime. There's one moment where executives came on set, pretty much everyone was asleep because they were waiting for everything to be reset, and it was taking an awful lot of time to do. A few little bits and bobs as well. A little girl from Jerry Goldsmith's Temple sang Gizmo's little song that you see in the movie. Also in the midst of this one as well is Michael Winslow. Now Michael Winslow is perhaps best known for his incredible voice work in the Police Academy films where he played Jones, but he also provides the voice of Stripe in Gremlins, and I asked him about this a few years ago, and I just said, what kind of brief were you given? And he just said, we barely saw anything. And he said because at that time Mr. Spielberg was just starting to hit his stride. They were finally paying attention to him, but a lot of folks were doing knockoffs of the work that he was doing, and that was a problem. So there was a veil of secrecy over this movie that I didn't really know. And so Winslow would say, I only saw the portions I was in. I never really met any of the on-screen folks. It was a security issue. And so he says it's great to be part of something that's secret, but there was an element of secrecy because this was a big new Spielberg project, even though Spielberg wasn't directing. One of the consequences of these sequences taking so long to do when it involved Gremlins as well, there's a bar sequence towards the end of the film, and it meant that bar sequence has popcorn and beer all over it. Apparently after 3-4 days working on that set, the place absolutely stank. One of the worst smells on a set that Dante has ever experienced by the sounds of it. But going back to Zach Galligan, because I just tried to get a flavour of what it was like, the gap between shooting all your stuff and then coming back and them having to shoot the stuff with the Gremlins afterwards. And Galligan said when we shot the first one, we started shooting in mid-April 83, we finished the first week of August for the human part. I left and went back to New York. They stayed there for another 4 months shooting nothing but creature stuff. And so Galligan recalls going back to the set in December of 1983, and he'd moved on with his life. He was excited about the film, and he said, I come back to the same studios to visit them, the same stages that I shot on 5 months earlier, and they're all still there, but burnt to a crisp, trying to get these puppets to do things. And that's not even mentioned all the pre-production work that went into it as well. I mean, there's one sequence, just to get across the complexity of it as well, where the Gremlins are walking down the street, and that's the one bit that's done in Harryhausen style, traditional stop frame animation. And then there's a sound effect halfway through of a light bulb blowing, and that's because they were working on that sequence for days, even weeks, and halfway through one of the bulbs blew, and they just realised we've got to work the mistake into this because we can't go back to square one and do it again. Filming did wrap up by the end of 1983, and the exhausted team then they still had battles to fight. Really, there were a few little bits and bobs that were a little bit easier in post production, such as persuading Warner Brothers to return the original Warner Brothers logo to the start of the film. It's the first time it had been used on a movie for quite some time. The fact too that the narration you get at the start of the film, well, that was an afterthought. Really, that wasn't how it was originally supposed to go, but it added, Dante figured, a kind of more fairy tale feel to it, and it got the story started quicker. The Warner Brothers executives, though, they got to a point where they saw the film and they'd been puzzled by the movie and they'd been relatively hands-off, but they liked it when they first saw it. But there was a studio note that said there were too many gremlins in it, to which Spielberg replied, "Should we cut them out and call the film People instead?" And it's important to note that Spielberg really backed his director on this one, and he didn't have to. And there's a brilliant moment in the film, and if you've seen the film you'll know the one where Phoebe Cates' character talks about why Christmas isn't quite so special for her, and Warner Brothers executives didn't like that at all. They wanted that out of the movie. Dante figured that is kind of the reason the movie exists, and so Warner Brothers were pushing, but Spielberg had final cut, and so Spielberg saw that sequence, didn't particularly like it, but had a chat with Dante about it, and Dante was adamant. It's just like, you've got to keep this in, and Spielberg sided with his director. But Dante would find out sometime later that right up to the release of the movie, Warner Brothers was still pushing and nagging Spielberg to try and get basically that sequence taken out of the movie. It was an extremely challenging picture to do with the extant technology, and Warner Bros. Didn't really believe in it or get it until they saw the preview. Joe Dante told me a few years ago, and he said at that time Spielberg had a policy of completely finishing the director's cut, so we didn't run the usual work print but a completed film with Jerry Goldsmith's score, and this was when they came to do the test screening for the movie. And he said nobody was prepared for the audience reaction, which was through the roof, or the phenomenon that it turned into. But that was ultimately how it went, and there was a moment really where the film was seen by an audience and all of a sudden it just clicked, and the people who were working that close to it didn't quite know what they had, the studio didn't know what they had, but when it was in front of an audience and audiences bought the character of Gizmo, which was seen by certainly the production team as a key moment in the movie, would they buy that this creature was real? They knew that they had something, and they didn't know until relatively late in the day, but they knew that they had something. So the film would be released in the June of 1984 in the US in the end, and it was billed as, Spielberg's name is all over the poster for it. And controversially, it got a PG rating in the US, and this followed Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom also getting a PG rating. And the complaints came in to the point where the Motion Picture Association of America changed their rating system. They introduced PG-13 off the back of Gremlins and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom because they just needed something a little bit harsher. It hadn't helped, well, it helped commercially, that the ad campaign had led people to think that they were getting something a bit more E.T. than they actually got. But when the film was released in cinemas, it came out at the same time as Ghostbusters, and there they are, top of the weekend chart, June the 8th, the 10th, 1984 in the US. Ghostbusters at 1, Gremlins at 2, Indiana Jones, the Temple of Doom at 3, Star Trek 3 is in 4th, and then a film called Beat Street was the other new opener that weekend, which opened in 5th place. However, there was still the UK release to come, and Warner Brothers, for the UK release, really wanted a PG certificate for the film. The British Board of Film Censors, as the BBFC was known as at the time, was not so keen, and Warner Brothers really lobbied hard for this one, and ultimately when the film came to its release, it got to the point, and this was a very, very big deal in the early 1980s, where it became headline news on the BBC News Bulletin, when there wasn't round the 24-hour news cycle or anything like that. To get on the news, you had to have a big story. So I'm going to play you 2 little clips from that news report just so you can get the idea of how Gremlins was going down. Here's, first of all, is the introduction to the report from the BBC's Nicholas Witchell on the BBC's flagship news programme.
A Christmas film which the censors said is too terrifying to be seen by British children began its run in London today. It's Gremlins from Steven Spielberg, the creator of E.T. and Raiders of the Lost Ark. The film's distributors, Warner Brothers, wanted it to have a PG certificate, the cautionary classification that says children can see it with parental guidance. But the British Board of Film Censors has ruled that no one under 15 may see it.
Brilliantly, that report then continues with correspondent Michael Cole sent to the London premiere of Gremlins, which took place at the end of 1984, and he does vox pop interviews with famous people coming out of the screening. So listen here for the opinions, particularly of Duran Duran lead singer Simon Brew, and at the end, right at the end, you get the infamous late British director Michael Winner of Death Wish fame, of course.
The censor's view was shared by some.
Yes, I thought it was appalling.
Tell me more.
I can't understand why Steven Spielberg lent his name to it, quite honestly.
Mr. Le Bon, do you think that film's suitable for under 15-year-olds?
Because I got a sense of humour, yes.
I think it depends on the child, really. But I think that's a pretty safe age, 15 and over.
Oh, I can't understand why that should be a 15 certificate. We have a very silly censor in this country. That's a children's film. A children's film in every other country in the world except this, because our censor is certifiable himself.
Never short of an opinion, Michael Winner. The film would go on to be a gigantic box office success. Off its $11 million budget, it would gross $212 million worldwide and continues to sell heavily on home formats, and he's a regular festive favourite as well. So much so that Warner Brothers, well, it wanted a sequel. But the whole story of Gremlins 2 is one I'm going to save for a future podcast. Which brings me to the halfway point of this one. If I can just do a quick couple of plugs before I get on with the next film. I'm an independent podcast producer. I am one person in a room trying to do my best with what I've got. If you like this podcast, it helps me enormously if you can subscribe to it, and ideally subscribe at your podcast repository of choice. Likewise, if I can tempt you to support my film magazines, Film Stories Monthly Magazine and Film Stories Junior, which is for under 15s, you'll find those at store.filmstories.co.uk. I think they're slightly different film magazines. I'm really proud of them, and there's now, between the two of them, 26 different issues to choose from, and hopefully you'll find something there that you like. I'm going to move on to the second of the two films for this episode, though, and this time it's a lesser known Christmas film. I also think it's the overlooked Kenneth Branagh film as well. Let's go back to 1995 then. I'll play you a quick clip and we'll come to the story the other side of this.
This production wants to be extremely innovative in the way we communicate.
Why are you rubbing low-calorie mayonnaise into your face?
It's hopeless!
It is rather fun all this sometimes, isn't it?
Absolutely hopeless!
Hello, kids. Do stop watching Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and come and watch a 400-year-old play about a depressed aristocrat.
Could Hamlet cast off thy coloured nighty and let thine eye look like a friend on Denmark? What do you think, darling?
What do you mean?
I'm speechless.
That's a clip then from 1995's In the Bleak Midwinter, or A Midwinter's Tale if you're in the US. I'll come to why shortly. Written and directed by Kenneth Branagh, a cast of his old chums really: Richard Briers, Celia Imrie, Michael Maloney, Jennifer Saunders, Julia Sawalha, John Sessions, Joan Collins in there as well. And the film really, well, it's interesting to see where it comes in Kenneth Branagh's directorial career, because by this point he'd picked up a couple of Oscar nominations for his short film Swan Song in 1992, for Henry V in 1989, but In the Bleak Midwinter followed his first box office disappointment and his first huge movie as well, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which had done far less than had been basically predicted and expected. Now, he'd broken through in his late 20s as a movie director with Henry V, and I've covered that in a previous Film Stories episode. He'd also written his memoir, which had got him no shortage of ridicule, material, but I think it's quite an interesting memoir, that particularly for someone written at such a young age as well. He then, off the back of Henry V, he went to America to shoot Dead again, which I'll come to in a future podcast. Then he came back to Britain for a low-budget film with his friends called Peter's Friends, which I've covered before. And then he did, after doing Swan Song, he did Much Ado About Nothing, which was a huge success, and he went on to do Frankenstein. So this then has taken us to I mean, we're in the early 1990s, and Branagh, around the release of In the Bleak Midwinter, said about 4 years ago, so that would put it about 1991, I wanted to do a piece that explored the idea of somebody changing their life completely by getting out of the acting business. I wanted to dramatise that moment of crisis when you stop in order to question what you're doing. And he said it happens to all actors, it certainly happens to me. It's always seemed to me a very funny thing to do because it's so pointless, and yet we all do it. And so what he began to formulate was the idea of basically a bunch of lovies putting on a production of Hamlet on Christmas Eve in a church hall, and then trying to convince people to come along and watch it. And so he worked with the idea on and off over the years, and he said over the years the idea evolved into something less pretentious, a rather self-mocking look at the way actors behave in these circumstances, and he said you could call it a comic look at existential despair. Now, Branagh drew extensively on his own experiences as an actor and also as touring as an actor. He told Studio Magazine that when he did a world tour with King Lear, he said, I felt like making a film to celebrate this strange companionship the life actors lead when they're on tour. A film homage to actors, to their passion, to their faith and to their courage. And he notes, even if of course this courage doesn't equal that of those who struggle against cancer or fight wars, I wanted to make a mocking and grating comedy, a fiction based on personal observations. And what he then went through the process with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein of dealing with Hollywood head on for the first time. And he said he did add some reflections about his experience in Hollywood into the ultimate screenplay that he shot. But he would insist, again, an interview this time with the San Francisco Chronicle, almost every incident in the film comes from some sort of life experience, and it's all sort of personal and real. I will also say I think In the Bleak Midwinter is incredibly funny as well. The first half in particular is very, very, very witty, and it exposes a comedy writing to Branagh that really hadn't come across on the screen before. But it was then a case of, well, when do you try and fit it all in? And thankfully, he'd been paid a monstrous amount of money to make Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. If you remember when that film came around, it basically followed Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Francis Ford Coppola had planned a whole host of, way before things like the Dark Universe and had become an idea for Universal, he'd planned a whole host of classic horror literature adaptations. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, produced by Coppola, was the second of them, and it saw Branagh starring opposite Robert De Niro. I should come to that in a future podcast as well. But when the box office fell and the reviews weren't great, he fell into a bit of a funk, but he had the money in his bank account. He'd also been planning at this point to bring the full text of Hamlet to the screen in a feature film version that would actually follow. He would do that immediately after In the Bleak Midwinter. He also took on an acting role in Othello, which he said was really helpful in kind of rebooting him after the disappointment he'd went through with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And he was fairly open about the fact that the failure of that film left him quite depressed. And he said, he did say, I get no more depressed than one is supposed to get. But nonetheless, it was described as the film had taken a bit of a shellacking, and he'd certainly borne the bruises of that. He thus decided to take some of the money that was sat in his bank account off the back of doing Frankenstein and invest that into a film of his own. That this is a crucial point with In the Bleak Midwinter, that this is a film that Branagh was able to pay for in its entirety, and that was the way he was able to get it up and running. It brought with it a whole host of restrictions of things that he couldn't do because he just simply didn't have the money, and the film would cost $1 million to make. So so under £1 million. He would shoot it in Surrey in England. He would find St Peter's Convent in Old Woking would basically be the core location for the movie. And so he completed the script. He wrote it with Michael Maloney in mind for the lead role in the film of the person who's trying to put on, Joe Harper, who's trying to put on this production of Hamlet on Christmas Eve. And there's quite a lot of him, he's admitted, in the character of Joe Harper. He offered Jimmy Yule was offered a role in the film as well, but couldn't because he was making Wycliffe at the time, apparently. But also, he basically reached out to his contacts book of friends and started to pull the cast together. The one person he hadn't had much interaction with at that point in his career was Joan Collins. And she ended up cast in the role of Margaretta Darcy in the film after Branagh had bumped into her at a film premiere. And Branagh said, she told me she had an appetite to do different kinds of things and would like to be in something where she had to really act. And Branagh recalled she talked as if she was a very young actress. He offered her the role in The Bleak Midwinter, and she accepted it, working on the same scale of pay as everyone else. One of the reasons, though, that he chose to ground his ensemble in people that he knew on the whole and was already familiar with was he knew he had to shoot this film very, very, very quickly. Even though the location wasn't expensive, even though there weren't huge special effects or anything like that, he had at most 3 weeks to get this in the can. Now, that's more than he had for Peter's Friends, which was done in just under a fortnight. But Branagh said, we were shooting so fast, I thought the film needed a kind of shorthand which would allow us to work well quickly. He said, I wanted people who themselves understood about putting on a show in a short space of time and people who knew each other so that it'd be easier to establish a sense of the rapport between members of the company. And he wanted to celebrate the camaraderie and the friendship, and he admitted about 7 or 8 of the characters were tailor-made for the actors in question, particularly John Sessions and Richard Briers. Now, Richard Briers, I do think he plays Henry Wakefield here, and I think it's his finest cinema role, and Branagh used him a lot in his film work. You'll find him in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and in Much Ado About Nothing as well. Once the cast had come together and was in place, Branagh drew on their experiences as well, and he admitted the cast made large contributions, and we did rewrites together, which then gradually made it more and more specific to the individual characters, that each actor was able to put something into the role and bring some of their own experiences to it as well. Now, just to make the job of ultimately selling the film that bit more tricky, another decision that Branagh made with his movie, and I think we can safely call it his movie, it was he wanted to shoot it in black and white. Now, this wasn't for financial reasons, and in fact, shooting a film in black and white in the 90s wasn't necessarily going to be cheaper anyway. It was very much the exception rather than the rule. I remember when Tim Burton went to shoot Ed Wood, it cost more basically to shoot that on black and white stock than it would have done on colour. In the case of In the Bleak Midwinter, what Branagh was trying to do was not save money, as it happened. He wanted to capture the story, the style of the 1950s comedies that he really loved himself, films that with the likes of Alec Guinness, with Mickey Rooney, and he wanted to get that kind of flavour to it, in much the same way that Joe Dante on Gremlins was wanting to shoot on a movie set just to capture the feel of older films. Branagh went about it in a slightly different way, but the decision was ultimately for pretty much the same reason, although there are fundamentally a lot less Gremlins in The Bleak Midwinter. Branagh did admit that his producers had asked him to make a colour film with American stars and a title more relevant for a comedy. The fact that he was trying to make a comedy with the word bleak in the title, well, that would cause some consternation a little bit down the line, but as he said, I did the exact opposite of what they recommended doing, and he'd tell this to the Sunday Times. Now, he did choose not to act in this one. I always get the sense within The Bleak Midwinter that it was a bit of a creative reboot on the big screen for Kenneth Branagh, and a kind of a dividing line between in the films that he was making, that he was building and building and building, and then after Frankenstein, he'd done the the big American movie. He went and followed, well, really the kind of passion stuff that he wanted to make for a while, that he would do, the films that he would make after this on Hamlet, Love's Labour's Lost, As You Like It, The Magic Flute and Sleuth. Well, none of them really would get an awful lot of attention, but I've interviewed him about this in the past, and he said he's very proud of them all, and ultimately he got to a point in the early 2010s where he accepted Marvel's offer to make Thor, because now he wanted to make films for a bigger audience. That was not the case within the Bleak Midwinter. He knew what he was getting into going in this particular instance. Branagh would tell Premiere UK magazine a bit more about the film in 1995, and he talked about being able to work independently after having gone through the Hollywood system. And he said, I don't have to explain anything to anyone. I didn't have to talk about the casting, didn't have to send rushes to America, didn't have to preview the movie. We made it, finished it, and we sold it. He said he was on the phone, a clucking sight less, let's just say that. You're not in front of that vast army of people representing the particular bureaucracy you're working for, stroking them. As a result, there was more space just to work, and that's what he did. He threw himself into this one, and there was that kinship amongst most of the actors. That said, most of the actors, it's quite hard to find interviews with any of them about the movie, and one who was slightly on the outside, who has talked about it in her memoir, is Celia Imrie, and she discusses it in her book The Happy Hoofer, because she wasn't part of that circle of actors that are kind of basically grown up together, and she came to doing In the Bleak Midwinter a few months after she'd done the first episode of Absolutely Fabulous. She admitted she was in the throes of postnatal depression at the time. She talks about that in her book, and she says, to make matters worse, despite having been put together by the same team as Frankenstein, the atmosphere on Midwinter was not nearly as free. It was all a bit carry on up your old varsity chums, and I felt quite a fool not being as well educated as the others. She said, I find that when many people from the upper echelons of ex-university life gather together, something very strange happens. They all turn into joke competitors, each trying to outdo the other with humorous anecdotes and one-liners, while you, the non-university ones, have to do an awful lot of grinning, even at times when you haven't got a clue what they're on about. That said, Imrie's performance in the film, whether she enjoyed making it or not, well, she takes on the role of she's just glorious. Absolutely glorious. I mean, Celia Imrie is always glorious, and she does talk far more positively as well in the book at the point where Joan Collins turned up on set, and she said, Collins, on her first day we sat and had lunch, or rather I should say I had lunch, while I watched Joan take 10 minutes to eat a grape. She explained to me how fizzy water was more fattening than still, and made me roar with laughter with a string of hilarious anecdotes and her swishy nonchalance, and Collins very much pitched in with this film as much as anyone. Branagh would tell the Times, he said, with this film that he felt like he was entering a new phase. He felt that this was hit and run filmmaking, that he'd enjoyed how quickly the film shot, and the challenge now of having a small amount of time and not much money, and he just relied on ingenuity to get this film making. And he says, I don't say it's the only way or the best way to work, but it felt like the right thing for me at the time. Branagh got then to a point where the film was ready for the Toronto International Film Festival, where it would debut on the 10th of September 1995, and this was the moment really, not just to see how it would go down, but also, would anyone buy the film? Would he get his money back on the movie? And so it once after its debut screening, he was in luck, but he'd made a really good film, and Castle Rock, owned by Rob Reiner, picked the movie up for the US off the back of that, and as a result of that single Castle Rock transaction to buy the US rights to the movie, and Castle Rock now has folded into Warner Brothers through a series of labyrinthine ways, or certainly their films have, and well, the bottom line for In the Bleak Midwinter was it was in profit already. The problem was that Castle Rock had huge reservations over the title of the film. It was going to plan to put the movie out. I mean, even though it's technically a Christmas movie, Castle Rock decided it was going to put it out in February 1996, but it didn't like the title at all, and it didn't want to have to sell a comedy movie in the American market with the word bleak in it. And that's why, whilst in Europe and the UK the film is called In the Bleak Midwinter, by the time it got to the US it had changed its name to A Midwinter's Tale, and that's still how it's known in America as well. As Branagh would talk about, he said they offered 100 different titles and pleaded with me not to have Bleak in the title. They said nobody in America knows the hymn in the Bleak Midwinter, which is based on, and that they'd had responses saying, is this his Bergman film? And Branagh replies, said, tell them it's my Carry On film. That's what it is. And I still had to explain what that meant. So I just said, it's British and funny. Nonetheless, the title had to change. The film got its release. And I mean, we're not talking huge blockbuster box office numbers. I mean, certainly when I did get to see in the Bleak Midwinter at the cinema in the UK, but I was living in the northwest of England at the time, and it just came round as the weekly director's chair showcase at the local multiplex. Walked in having no idea what I was going to get and absolutely laughed my socks off. I still think that the film is an enormously underrated comedy movie and enormously underrated Christmas movie as well. Now, the beauty of the film being in profit is, and I got to speak to Branagh about this a few years ago, it meant that the money was back in his pocket by the time it came to the cast and crew screening. And he told me of the film, it was very personal to the point of having paid for it, and it was one of life's great pleasures to sell it for a bit more than you paid. And at the cast and crew screening, as everybody came out, giving everyone a cheque. And he picked this up with he explained to the Sunday Times, he just said he asked the cast and crew from Joan Collins right the way to the clapper loader to do it for minimum money, promising them a percentage later that would reflect their hierarchical position in the film. And Branagh had warned everyone, you might get nothing at all, but then he said, now we've sold the film to Castle Rock in the States, everyone's already got a cheque and I can pay my tax. Branagh admitted, I'd worried whether it was going to travel. One always does with comedies, but it's already played at the Venice Film Festival, which it played at 3 weeks after it debuted in Canada. And I watched it with Italians and subtitles, and they laughed. They even gave us a prize. I think they made one up for us. But then he said it wasn't surprising, given all the other movies at the Venice Film Festival that year were 2.5 hours of tragedy. He talked about handing the money out to people on the way out of that first screening, and he says, you've never seen a more surprised woman than Joan Collins walking out the back of one of the smaller cinemas in Leicester Square, and we were sitting there like people with notes in a brown envelope. And Joan Collins had been paid £400 a week along with everyone else at that point, and she got given an envelope stuffed full of banknotes, and he just described that as such a pleasure. The only downside really within the Bleak Midwinter / Midwinter's Tale is it's a bit of a forgotten Christmas movie. It's one of the reasons I've done it in this podcast really, but also the fact that I really like the film an awful lot. And it's a film that got a video release in the UK from Columbia way back in the 90s, but trying to find it on DVD and Blu-ray has been tricky up until the point where the Warner Archive Service in the US has released a Blu-ray of it. Now the Warner Archive Service is that do limited runs, and they make the discs on demand on the whole, but for the first time a couple of years ago it became possible to get a Blu-ray release of In the Bleak Midwinter, even though you're not getting any extras on it or anything like that. It's just the fact that the film exists again on some kind of physical form. I do recommend making the effort to check this one out and find it if you can. I do think it's really worth it, and in particular I just think it's a terrific testament to the late great Richard Priors. I really adore his work in this movie, and I can't commend it to you enough. Which brings me to the end of the 150th episode of Film Stories. Crikey, just saying that makes me feel old. You can get more of my witterings on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can get more from the podcast on Twitter, from the Film Stories Project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. There's a website, filmstories.co.uk, updated every weekday with loads of features and news stories and reviews, and it's all clickbait free as well. I'm trying to make it as clickbait free as I can. Do pick me up if I haven't done it. Filmstories.co.uk. If you want to buy subscriptions or back issues or anything of our magazine, that's store.filmstories.co.uk. You can find us on YouTube with some video exclusive Film Stories stuff at youtube.com/filmstories, Facebook as well, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. And that's that. I've come to the end of another episode of the podcast. There's only 1 or 2 left this side of Christmas before we take our winter break. The most important thing, though, is that you all stay safe and well, particularly during these tricky times. I thank you, as always, for listening. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your eardrums. And I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Take care. Bye-bye.